The morning following Whimsy's visit to Thornfield Manor proved to be one of those characteristically grey British autumnal affairs where the sky seemed to press down upon the landscape with the weight of personal disappointment. He sat in the breakfast room of the Crown and Lion, nursing a cup of tea that had long since surrendered any claim to warmth, and contemplated the several facts that Inspector Bracegirdle had inadvertently provided during their conversation the previous evening. The inspector, in his earnest desire to establish the guilt of young James Ashford, had actually constructed a rather compelling argument for his innocence, a circumstance that would have amused Whimsy tremendously had the matter not involved a woman lying permanently deceased upon a Turkish carpet. What interested Whimsy far more than James's alibied movements was the peculiar behavior of Mrs. Ashford herself during the hours preceding her demise, a matter upon which the inspector had shed remarkably little light and concerning which Miss Phyllis Ashford had proven frustratingly evasive. According to the household servants, Mrs. Ashford had maintained a rigorous daily schedule of almost ceremonial exactitude. She rose at 7:30, took her breakfast in the morning room at precisely 8 o'clock, attended to her correspondence until 10, rested in her private sitting room until 12:30, took luncheon with her daughter, and then devoted her afternoons to various charitable pursuits and social obligations. On the evening in question, she had altered this routine in a manner that no one seemed to find particularly remarkable, though Whimsy found it to be the single most remarkable fact thus far uncovered. She had announced at luncheon that she would rest earlier than usual that day, claiming a slight headache, and had retired to her sitting room at 2 o'clock. She had not emerged until approximately 7 o'clock, when she had come down to the library, changed into the aforementioned cream-coloured cardigan, and settled herself with a novel and her needlework, a basket of fine embroidery that sat, untouched, beside the reading chair where the cardigan had been draped. The peculiarity of this behaviour lay not in its eccentricity. Elderly widows of substantial means were entitled to alter their schedules as whim dictated, but in the fact that it contradicted entirely what the household servants had universally reported as Mrs. Ashford's unvarying custom. She had not, in point of fact, rested at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Young Thomas, the second footman, had encountered her in the upper corridor at approximately 3 o'clock, carrying what he described as a great stack of papers and ledgers, moving with what he termed a purposeful air, towards the small study that Mrs. Ashford maintained for the management of her considerable estates. Furthermore, the gardener's boy had observed her from the grounds at approximately 4:30, standing at the study window with her arms folded across her chest, gazing out toward the ornamental lake with an expression that he had hesitantly described as troubled or preoccupied. These observations had been provided to Whimsy not by the local constabulary, who had failed to conduct anything approaching a thorough interview of the outdoor servants, but by the servants themselves, volunteered with the sort of careful discretion that suggested they understood their significance, even if they could not articulate it. What this timeline established, with remarkable clarity to anyone possessed of the requisite attention to detail, was that Mrs. Ashford had not been resting quietly in her sitting room at 2 o'clock, as she had claimed at luncheon. Instead, she had been engaged in some form of activity that required the consultation of papers and ledgers, an activity that had clearly troubled her sufficiently to warrant a contemplative vigil at the study window an hour or more later. The announcement of a headache and the intention to rest appeared, upon closer examination, to have been a deliberate deception, the sort of transparent excuse that a woman of Mrs. Ashford's intelligence might construct not to prevent family members from disturbing her, but to ensure that no one would think to inquire where she had been or what she had been doing during those critical hours. Whimsy had taken the liberty, during his evening departure from Thornfield, of examining the small study with the sort of casual curiosity that he had attempted to pass off as mere idle wandering. What he had discovered was illuminating primarily through its absence. The study itself was meticulously maintained, its desk clear of all materials, its filing cabinet locked with a discretion that suggested it contained matters of some sensitivity. The ledgers and papers that young Thomas had observed Mrs. Ashford carrying had been returned to this cabinet with obvious care. There was, however, one detail that had escaped the attention of whoever had returned these materials to their proper place, a small notation, written in a feminine hand upon the back of an envelope that had fallen behind the wastepaper basket, reading simply MC 1903, with a question mark appended, as if Mrs. Ashford had been endeavoring to verify some memory or confirm some unpleasant suspicion. The initials meant nothing to anyone else at Thornfield, naturally. But then, Wimsey reflected as he finished his now cold tea and prepared to conduct his second visit to the manor, the initials did not need to mean anything to anyone else. They merely needed to mean something to Mrs. Ashford herself, and, judging by the troubled expression that the gardener's boy had observed at the study window, and the vigorous blow that had been delivered to her skull several hours later, they clearly had meant something rather desperately important indeed. The Evening Cardigan, Wimsey now understood with the clarity of dawning comprehension, was not merely a detail overlooked by the police. It was the key to understanding precisely why Mrs. Ashford had chosen to disturb the dust of 22-year-old secrets, and, more significantly, why someone had chosen to ensure she would never speak of what she had discovered. Wimsey's second visit to Thornfield Manor was undertaken with the ostensible purpose of offering his condolences to the bereaved family and paying his respects to the deceased, a courtesy that seemed to strike Inspector Bracegirdle as both unnecessary and vaguely suspicious, as if Wimsey's continued interest in the matter suggested some criminal inclination on his own part. The inspector had, by this time, begun to entertain serious doubts about whether young James Ashford might not, after all, have contrived some manner of elaborate deception regarding his whereabouts, though the 7 witnesses at the Crown and Lion presented a rather insurmountable obstacle to this theory. Bracegirdle had begun examining the servants with renewed vigor, apparently operating under the assumption that one of them must have committed the murder, a notion that Wimsey found both logically sound and entirely misdirected, rather like a man searching for his lost watch beneath a lamp-post simply because the light was better there than in the surrounding darkness. He greeted the inspector with warmth and apparent enthusiasm, inquired after his progress with the sort of polite interest that concealed his absolute conviction that no progress whatsoever had been made, and then excused himself with the explanation that he wished to pay his respects to Miss Ashford, who had, he understood, been managing the household arrangements with admirable fortitude. Miss Phyllis Ashford received him in the drawing-room, a chamber of considerable elegance that somehow managed to communicate an almost oppressive atmosphere of restrained grief. She was dressed as custom dictated, in deep mourning, though her face bore the peculiar quality of someone who had weathered a tempest, and emerged not broken but somehow fundamentally altered by the experience. She was, Wimsey noted, precisely the sort of woman who would have been considered accomplished and agreeable by polite society, well-educated, well-mannered, possessed of a moderate prettiness that had perhaps once held the promise of beauty before life had applied its various subtle pressures and refinements. She was also, Wimsey determined within the first 90 seconds of conversation, a woman laboring beneath the weight of a terrible secret, which she carried with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to bearing burdens without complaint. The conversation that followed was, on the surface, entirely conventional. Wimsey offered his sympathies regarding her mother's untimely demise, inquired after her brother James and his fiancée, and made several observations about the particular cruelty of violent death when it occurred within the sanctuary of one's own home. Miss Ashford responded to all of these overtures with the appropriate expressions of gratitude and sorrow, her voice steady and her composure admirably maintained. However, when Wimsey ventured to observe, in the manner of one making idle conversation, that her mother must have been a woman of considerable independence of spirit to have established such a rigorous and disciplined routine, and that such discipline often reflected a desire to maintain order in matters that one found trivial. Bling! Miss Ashford's hand trembled noticeably as she reached for her teacup. It was a small gesture, barely perceptible to anyone not specifically observing for such signs, but it was sufficient to confirm Wimsey's suspicion that Miss Ashford possessed knowledge relevant to the circumstances surrounding her mother's death. What interested him was not whether she had committed the murder, a matter upon which his mind was already substantially made up, but rather what she knew about the true motivation underlying the crime. He proceeded, therefore, with considerably more delicacy, and remarked that he had always found it rather fascinating how women of Mrs. Ashford's generation often maintained private pursuits and concerns that were never discussed with their families, purely from a sense of discretion and respect for the proprieties. Such women, he suggested, often kept private papers and records relating to matters that they preferred to handle entirely through their own judgment, unencumbered by the well-intentioned interference of those who loved them. Miss Ashford had grown quite pale during this observation, and her fingers had begun twisting the fabric of her mourning dress with an intensity that suggested considerable inner distress. When Whimsy gently inquired whether her mother had, perhaps, been concerned about some matter relating to the estates or family affairs during the weeks preceding her death, Miss Ashford had finally broken the absolute composure she had maintained since the previous evening's discovery. Not dramatically, and not with the theatricality that one might expect from a woman of lesser restraint, but with the quiet, controlled expression of someone whose emotional reserves have been entirely depleted by circumstances beyond their control. She had, she admitted in a voice scarcely above a whisper, become aware that her mother had been investigating some matter of considerable personal significance. She did not know what this matter was, but she had observed her mother's increasing distress during the weeks preceding her death, and she had understood, with the terrible clarity that only a devoted daughter can achieve, that whatever her mother had discovered had caused her profound unhappiness. When Whimsy pressed her further, gently, and with all the sympathy of which he was capable, Miss Ashford had revealed that on the afternoon preceding the murder, she had encountered her mother in the upper corridor, emerging from the small study with papers in her hands and an expression of absolute anguish upon her face. Her mother had said nothing, had simply proceeded to her sitting room and closed the door with a sort of quiet finality that suggested she wished to be entirely alone with whatever thoughts were troubling her so severely. That was the last time Miss Ashford had seen her mother alive. The Evening Cardigan, she suddenly remembered, her voice breaking slightly as she spoke, had belonged originally to her grandmother. Her mother had treasured it particularly because it had been a gift from someone she had known in her youth, before her marriage to Mr. Ashford. She did not know who had given it to her, but she knew it had been someone her mother had cared for very deeply indeed. The revelation regarding the Evening Cardigan, while emotionally affecting, provided Whimsy with precisely the logical scaffolding he required to begin constructing a coherent narrative of events. He left Thornfield Manor with Miss Ashford's tearful gratitude, following his assurance that her mother's killer would be brought to justice, an assurance that he conveyed with the sort of quiet confidence that suggested he possessed knowledge considerably more concrete than the scattered observations and half-formed suspicions that C.U. Rentley constituted his actual working theory. What he possessed, in fact, was a framework, a skeletal structure upon which the flesh of motive, opportunity, and method could be systematically arranged. The Evening Cardigan, far from being a trivial detail, represented a direct link to the emotional architecture of Mrs. Ashford's murder, for no woman removes a cherished garment associated with profound personal memories without reason, and the very fact of its removal suggested a desire to distance oneself from that cherished past, if only symbolically, before confronting whatever truth she had discovered in those ledgers that afternoon. Whimsy's next course of action involved a consultation with the Ashford family solicitors, a firm of considerable antiquity known as Weatherby and Sons, situated in a narrow street in the market town of Ashford proper, an establishment that still maintained the slightly musty odor of legal documents and propriety that characterized most English law offices of substantial years and conservative practice. The senior partner, Mr. Edmund Weatherby, was a man of approximately 70 years, possessed of the sort of meticulously groomed appearance that suggested he had never encountered a day of his life that he did not approach with the utmost seriousness. He received Whimsy with the sort of careful courtesy that solicitors reserve for members of the aristocracy, which is to say with rather more warmth than he would have extended to an ordinary client, but with considerably less warmth than he might have extended to someone he actually knew. Whimsy had taken the precaution of explaining his interest in the matter through the fiction of being engaged by the family to ensure that the police investigation proceeded with appropriate thoroughness, a deception that sat so lightly upon his conscience as to be entirely imperceptible. Whimsy required, he explained, was access to certain historical records relating to Mrs. Ashford's family, specifically information regarding her life prior to her marriage to Mr. Cecil Ashford in 1903. He made this request with the careful vagueness of a man who does not wish to appear to be investigating matters of excessive personal delicacy, but who nevertheless possesses legitimate reasons for requiring such information. Mr. Weatherby had initially demurred, citing the confidentiality of client affairs, but when Whimsy had observed that a woman's murder was rather more serious than the usual canons of professional discretion, and that any information withheld might impede the discovery of truth and justice, the solicitor had undergone a visible reconsideration of his obligations. After some deliberation, he had consented to reveal that Mrs. Ashford, who had been Miss Margaret Cornwell prior to her marriage, had been, in her youth, engaged to be married to a gentleman of considerable promise named Edward Harrington. The engagement had been terminated quite suddenly in the spring of 1903, approximately 3 months before her marriage to Mr. Cecil Ashford. The reasons for this termination, Mr. Weatherby had explained with the delicate circumspection of his profession, had never been fully disclosed, though there had been certain circumstances surrounding Mr. Harrington's involvement in financial improprieties that had rendered the match impossible to continue. The initials MC therefore referred not to the current Mrs. Ashford, but to her maiden name, Margaret Cornwell. The notation MC 1903 that Whimsy had discovered suggested that Mrs. Ashford had, in her investigation of the papers and ledgers that afternoon, encountered something relating to events of that year, something sufficiently significant to require verification and to prompt an investigation. Had cost her, ultimately, her life. When Whimsy had inquired whether Mr. Harrington was still living, Mr. Weatherby had consulted his records with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to maintaining comprehensive documentation, and had informed him that Mr. Edward Harrington had, in fact, died in the year 1912, a demise that had resulted from injuries sustained in a rather celebrated scandal involving embezzlement from his employer's firm. However, Mr. Harrington had not died alone. He had left behind a widow and 3 children, the eldest of whom, a daughter named Catherine, would now be approaching the age of 29. This information, innocuous on its surface, had struck Whimsy with the force of absolute revelation, though he had maintained his expression of polite interest, and had thanked Mr. Weatherby for his assistance with the sort of gracious courtesy that suggested he had learned nothing of particular significance. What he had actually learned, however, was that Edward Harrington's daughter Catherine had, in the intervening years since her father's death and her mother's presumed remarriage or death, presumably been living a life of obscurity somewhere in the English provinces, entirely unaware, or perhaps painfully aware, that the woman who had jilted her father in 1903 had been prospering comfortably as the wife of Mr. Cecil Ashford and the mother of 2 children. The question that now presented itself with crystalline clarity was this: had Catherine Harrington discovered her connection to Mrs. Ashford? And if so, had she discovered something else as well? Something that Mrs. Ashford had herself only begun to uncover that very afternoon, something sufficiently damning to warrant murder? The household staff at Thornfield Manor, like the servants in most well-regulated English homes, possessed that peculiar combination of invisibility and omnisci, hence that allowed them to observe the comings and goings of the family with a thoroughness that would have impressed a professional investigator, had anyone possessed the inclination to interrogate them with appropriate thoroughness. Inspector Bracegirdle had conducted what he termed interviews with the servants, which had consisted primarily of asking them whether they had seen anything suspicious on the evening in question, a question so vague and so general that it had elicited responses of equal vagueness and generality. Whimsy, by contrast, had discovered through the expedient of a carefully casual conversation with Mrs. Hartwell, the head housekeeper, that a visitor had called at Thornfield Manor on no fewer than 3 occasions during the preceding month, a visitor who had been received by Mrs. Ashford in the small study with the door firmly closed, and whose visits had been conducted with such discretion that even the servants, those arbiters of household knowledge, had been uncertain of the visitor's identity or the purpose of these clandestine meetings. The third visit, Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned with the sort of significant understatement that characterized her class and profession, had occurred on the very afternoon of Mrs. Ashford's death at approximately 2 o'clock. The visitor had remained for nearly 2 hours and had departed at approximately 4 o'clock, at which time Mrs. Ashford had appeared somewhat distressed and had immediately retired to her sitting room with instructions that she was not to be disturbed. The visitor, insofar as Mrs. Hartwell could determine, and Mrs. Hartwell's determination on such matters was generally quite reliable, had been a woman of approximately 30 years of age, of refined appearance and educated bearing, though she had not arrived by the customary means of a hired motor car, but rather had walked up the drive-through, the direction of the village, as if she had either arrived by train or had been dropped at some distance from the house to avoid drawing attention to her arrival. This information, combined with what Whimsy had learned from Mr. Weatherby, suggested a scenario of considerable psychological complexity. Catherine Harrington, assuming it was indeed she who had visited Thornfield, had either recently discovered her father's connection to Mrs. Ashford, or had been aware of it for some time and had only recently resolved to confront the woman who had, in her youthful callousness, destroyed her father's reputation and precipitated the financial catastrophe that had rendered her childhood one of comparative penury and social shame. The visit itself, however, presented an interpretive puzzle of considerable delicacy. If Catherine had arrived with murderous intent, she would hardly have remained for 2 hours engaged in what appeared to be an extended conversation. If, conversely, she had arrived seeking merely to confront Mrs. Ashford with the facts of her parentage and the damage done, the conversation would have been conducted with considerably less restraint than Mrs. Hartwell's account suggested. What seemed more probable was that the two women had engaged in some form of negotiation or discussion regarding matters of mutual concern, a discussion that had been interrupted or curtailed by the arrival of evening and the necessity of Catherine's departure before the household began its preparations for dinner. Mrs. Ashford had then spent the subsequent hours engaged in the examination of her ledgers and papers, searching presumably for evidence relating to whatever claims or accusations Catherine had made during their conversation. Whatever she had found had clearly been either confirmatory or revelatory in nature, because it had prompted her to settle herself in the Libra. Wry with her needlework in a state of evident distress, a circumstance that suggested she was steeling herself for some difficult decision or action that would need to be undertaken in the near future. Whimsy had therefore reached a critical juncture in his investigation, one at which the logical threads of motive and method began to interweave in patterns of considerable psychological interest. The murder of Mrs. Ashford had, on the surface, all the characteristics of a crime of passion, a sudden burst of violence occasioned by rage or desperation. Yet the evidence suggested something considerably more deliberate and calculated. The killer had possessed access to the house, had known precisely where Mrs. Ashford would be at a given time, and had chosen a moment when that access would not be remarked upon. More significantly, the killer had possessed sufficient presence of mind to remove the evening cardigan from Mrs. Ashford's person and to arrange it upon the reading chair in such a manner as to suggest she had simply removed it and set it aside, a detail that would, to any observer, confirm that Mrs. Ashford had been preparing herself for something, even if that something was merely death. The question that now demanded resolution was this: had Catherine Harrington committed the murder herself, driven by accumulated rage and the desire for revenge? Or had she somehow precipitated the murder through her revelations and accusations, setting in motion a chain of events that had resulted in Mrs. Ashford's death at the hands of someone else entirely, someone for whom the exposure of those 22-year-old secrets represented not merely a matter of personal betrayal, but a genuine threat to their continued security and well-being? Inspector Bracegirdle, Whimsy reflected with a degree of pitying amusement, had not even begun to ask the right questions. He remained entirely focused on James Ashford's movements and James Ashford's supposed motive, never once considering that the victim's death might have been precipitated by events and relationships that had nothing whatsoever to do with the current generation of the Ashford family, and everything to do with secrets buried so deeply in the past that their exhumation had seemed nearly impossible until the afternoon when a visitor had walked up the drive from the village and forced a reckoning that Mrs. Ashford had not anticipated. The village of Ashford in the water, despite its rather picturesque name and the general impression it conveyed of rustic tranquility, proved upon closer examination to be the sort of small English community where every person's business was, by customary right, the business of everyone else, a circumstance that Whimsy exploited with the sort of casual efficiency that suggested he had spent a considerable portion of his life extracting information from people who believed themselves to be engaged in mere pleasantries. The vicar's wife, the postmistress, the proprietor of the lending library, and the landlord of the Crown and Lion had all, through the expedient of carefully introduced remarks and politely phrased inquiries, provided Whimsy with a remarkably comprehensive portrait of the young woman who had recently taken rooms at the Grange, a modest but respectable boarding house situated at the far end of the village street. Her name was Miss Catherine Ashford, she claimed, and she had arrived in the village approximately 3 weeks prior under circumstances that had aroused considerable local interest and speculation. She had come alone, had taken rooms for an indefinite period, and had conducted herself with a reserve and propriety that the village matrons found both admirable and faintly suspect, the sort of character that suggested either considerable breeding, NG, or considerable tragedy, or possibly some combination of the two. More significantly, Miss Catherine Ashford had been observed, on several occasions, walking in the direction of Thornfield Manor, though whether she had actually approached the house or had merely walked in that general direction remained a matter of some uncertainty and considerable local debate. The proprietress of the Grange, a Mrs. Wickham, a widow of apparently substantial means, who had retired to the village some 5 years prior, had been notably reticent regarding her new lodger, a reticence that suggested either professional discretion or a deliberate desire to conceal information, neither of which was typical of Mrs. Wickham's generally voluble nature. When Whimsy had presented himself at the Grange under the transparent pretext of inquiring whether Mrs. Wickham might have rooms available for a friend of his visiting the area, he had been received with a degree of caution that suggested his reputation for investigative subtlety had, despite his efforts at discretion, preceded him. Mrs. Wickham was a woman of approximately 60 years, possessed of the sort of handsome, capable appearance that suggested she had spent her youth in some position of consequence, and her maturity in the acquisition and consolidation of comfort. She had, Whimsy noted, the particular quality of someone who had made the conscious decision not to concern herself overmuch with the conventions of polite society, though she maintained those conventions with scrupulous precision where they were likely to be observed. When Whimsy had ventured to inquire whether Miss Catherine Ashford might be available for a brief conversation, Mrs. Wickham had regarded him with an expression of considerable calculation, before responding that Miss Ashford was, unfortunately, not presently in residence, though she might return within the Hoe. She had, however, consented to provide Whimsy with tea in her private sitting-room, a circumstance that suggested she wished to discuss some matter with him that was not appropriate for the drawing-room, where servants might overhear. What Mrs. Wickham had revealed during the course of this private conversation was that Catherine Ashford was indeed the daughter of Edward Harrington, though she had legally adopted her mother's maiden name following her father's death and her mother's subsequent remarriage to a gentleman in the north of England. Catherine had grown up with the knowledge that her father had been involved in some form of financial scandal, though the precise details had been withheld from her until quite recently, when a cousin had provided her with newspaper accounts from the period relating to her father's disgrace and the woman whose testimony had contributed substantially to his downfall. Catherine had come to Ashford in the Water not with any clear plan of action, Mrs. Wickham had explained, but rather with the vague intention of discovering what had become of Mrs. Ashford, and whether the woman who had caused her father's ruin now lived in some state of guilt or continued to prosper in unconscious obliviousness to the damage she had wrought. What had occurred during Catherine's visit to Thornfield Manor on the afternoon of the murder remained. Mrs. Wickham had maintained with considerable firmness a matter of confidentiality between herself and her lodger. However, she had volunteered the observation that Catherine had returned from that visit in a state of considerable emotional disturbance, had remained secluded in her room throughout the evening, and had only emerged the following morning to inquire whether the police were likely to question her regarding her presence in the vicinity of Thornfield Manor. This inquiry had been made in a tone suggesting not guilt, but rather anxiety regarding her position as a stranger in the village, an anxiety that suggested the young woman understood perfectly well how her presence in the area during the commission of a murder might be viewed by the authorities. When Whimsy had delicately suggested that Catherine might wish to provide a clear accounting of her movements on the evening in question, Mrs. Wickham had responded with a degree of asperity that suggested she was not a woman to be manipulated through implication, and that if Whimsy wished information, he would be better served by inquiring of Catherine directly. It was at this point that Whimsy had become aware of a crucial difficulty in his investigation. Catherine Harrington, by her own movements and her documented presence in the vicinity of Thornfield Manor, had placed herself in a position where she could quite easily be suspected of Mrs. Ashford's murder. Yet everything about her behavior suggested not the calculated deception of a woman attempting to conceal guilt, but rather the anxious concern of an innocent person suddenly caught in circumstances that appeared deeply incriminating. If Catherine had murdered Mrs. Ashford in a moment of passionate rage following their conversation, she would hardly have remained at the Grange and submitted herself to potential questioning. If she was innocent, however, then the murder had been committed by someone else entirely, someone who had possessed both knowledge of Mrs. Ashford's distressed state and the opportunity to exploit that distress to fatal effect. The conversation that Whimsy subsequently conducted with Catherine Ashford in the sitting room of the Grange proved to be one of considerable delicacy and psychological complexity, conducted with the sort of careful courtesy that he extended only to those individuals whose circumstances had rendered them simultaneously pitiable and potentially culpable. Catherine was, upon closer examination, a woman of considerable refinement and evident education, possessed of the sort of quiet dignity that suggested she had learned, through years of necessity, to maintain composure in the face of social ostracism and personal disappointment. She received Whimsy's inquiries regarding her visit to Thornfield Manor with a frankness that suggested either complete innocence or a degree of calculated candor so sophisticated as to be almost indistinguishable from genuine truthfulness. She had come to the village, Catherine explained, with no clear intention other than to ascertain whether the woman known as Mrs. Ashford was indeed the same Margaret Cornwell who had been engaged to her father in 1903. When she had confirmed this fact, through the simple expedient of inquiring at the lending library regarding the residence of Thornfield Manor, she had spent several days in a state of considerable indecision, uncertain whether confronting Mrs. Ashford would serve any purpose beyond providing momentary satisfaction for grievances that had, in any case, been dormant for more than 2 decades. It was only when Mrs. Wickham had suggested, in the course of a casual conversation, that a direct confrontation might provide Catherine with the closure necessary to move forward with her life, that she had resolved to present herself at Thornfield Manor and request an audience with Mrs. Ashford. What had transpired during that audience was, according to Catherine's account, a conversation of extraordinary emotional intensity, conducted with a degree of candor on both sides that had surprised both parties. Mrs. Ashford had, upon learning Catherine's identity, experienced an immediate shock of recognition that had left her visibly trembling. She had, however, recovered her composure with admirable swiftness and had invited Catherine into the study, where they had spent nearly 2 hours in discussion of events that had occurred more than 2 decades prior. Mrs. Ashford had, Catherine reported, attempted to explain the circumstances that had necessitated the termination of her engagement to Edward Harrington, circumstances that had involved financial complications and family pressures that had rendered continuation of the engagement impossible. More significantly, Mrs. Ashford had revealed to Catherine that the accusations against her father regarding embezzlement had been substantially more complex than the newspaper accounts had suggested, and that there existed certain documents and ledgers that might, if examined with appropriate care, substantially alter the historical record regarding Edward Harrington's culpability. It was this revelation, Catherine explained with evident emotion, that had prompted Mrs. Ashford to retire to her study immediately following Catherine's departure, to examine the family papers with the intention of locating the documents that might exonerate her father's memory. Catherine had observed nothing of Mrs. Ashford's state of mind that would suggest impending catastrophe. On the contrary, Mrs. Ashford had seemed energized by the prospect of potentially rectifying. After so many years, a grave injustice perpetrated against a man whose only true crime had been the misfortune of becoming entangled in the financial machinations of unscrupulous employers. Catherine had departed Thornfield Manor in a state of considerable emotional exhaustion, but also with a sense that some form of resolution might finally be possible, a sense that had been shattered by the discovery the following morning that Mrs. Ashford had been murdered on the very evening of their conversation. The alibi that. Catherine provided for the hours between 4 o'clock, when she had departed Thornfield Manor, and 9:30, when Mrs. Ashford had been discovered dead, was both simple and difficult to verify with absolute certainty. She had returned directly to the Grange, had taken supper alone in her room, and had spent the evening engaged in quiet contemplation, emerging only the following morning to learn of the tragedy that had befallen the woman she had only just begun to know. Mrs. Wickham, when questioned regarding this account, had confirmed that Catherine had returned to the Grange at approximately 4:30 and had not emerged again until the following morning, though she acknowledged that she could not, with absolute certainty, verify that Catherine had remained in her room throughout the evening, as the Grange was constructed in such a manner as to permit a determined individual to depart through the rear entrance without being observed. Yet as Wimsey departed the Grange in the fading light of late afternoon, he found himself convinced by Catherine's account, not because it was entirely watertight in its factual verification, but because of something far more subtle and far more reliable, the fundamental coherence of her emotional narrative. Catherine's tears, when she had spoken of her father's vindication and the possibility of restoring his reputation, had possessed the quality of genuine grief and genuine hope. Her descriptions of Mrs. Ashford's demeanor and words had carried the specificity of true recollection, rather than the vaguer quality of fabricated detail. Most significantly, Catherine's anxiety regarding her position as a stranger in the village during the commission of a murder had carried the authentic flavor of innocence, rather than the calculated concern of a guilty conscience. If Catherine Ashford had murdered Mrs. Ashford, she would have done S.O. with considerably less emotional involvement and considerably more methodical attention to the construction of an airtight alibi. The murder, therefore, had been committed by someone else, someone whose relationship to Mrs. Ashford and whose knowledge of her activities that afternoon was considerably more intimate than Catherine's could possibly be. The Evening Cardigan, as Wimsey had observed from the earliest moments of his investigation, was not merely a garment but a repository of emotional significance, and it was precisely this emotional significance that now demanded closer examination. He had, in the course of his inquiries, ascertained that the cardigan had been a gift to the young Margaret Cornwell from Edward Harrington during the period of their engagement, presented to her on the occasion of her 23rd birthday, and cherished by her throughout the subsequent years of her marriage to Mr. Cecil Ashford, who had apparently been either oblivious to or deliberately indifferent regarding the sentimental origins of the garment. What interested Wimsey, however, was not the history of the cardigan itself, but rather the circumstances that would have prompted Mrs. Ashford to remove it immediately prior to her death. No woman divests herself of a cherished possession bearing the weight of profound personal memories without experiencing some form of psychological rupture or emotional transition. The removal of the cardigan suggested not merely a desire for physical comfort, but a symbolic disengagement from the past that the garment represented. A disengagement that would have been psychologically necessary if Mrs. Ashford had resolved to take some action that she perceived as a betrayal of the emotional ties that bound her to Edward Harrington's memory. This observation had led Whimsy to a critical reconsideration of the timeline of events on the evening of the murder. Mrs. Ashford had spent the afternoon in the study, examining ledgers and papers, apparently seeking documentation that would substantiate Catherine's claims regarding Edward Harrington's innocence. By the time she had settled herself in the library with her needlework and the evening cardigan removed from her person, she would have reached some form of conclusion regarding what she had discovered. The very fact of her settling herself with needlework suggested not a woman preparing for a confrontation or an unpleasant obligation, but rather a woman steeling herself for some difficult internal decision. The removal of the cardigan suggested, furthermore, that this decision had involved some form of psychological repudiation of the past, a rejection of the emotional connections that had bound her to Edward Harrington and, by extension, to the circumstances that had necessitated the termination of their engagement. It was precisely at this juncture that Whimsy's investigation underwent a subtle but crucial reorientation. He had been operating under the assumption that Mrs. Ashford's murder had been precipitated by her intention to reveal or vindicate Edward Harrington's reputation. Yet, what if the situation had been considerably more complex? What if, in the course of examining the ledgers and papers that afternoon, Mrs. Ashford had discovered not merely evidence of Edward Harrington's innocence, but evidence of something far more disturbing, evidence that implicated someone else entirely in the financial crime that had resulted in Harrington's disgrace and downfall? What if the true perpetrator of the embezzlement had been someone whose identity Mrs. Ashford had known all along but had deliberately concealed for reasons of family loyalty or personal preservation? With this possibility in mind, Whimsy had returned to Thornfield Manor on a pretext of clarifying cert. Minor details with Inspector Bracegirdle, and had taken the opportunity to conduct a more exhaustive examination of the study, paying particular attention to the filing cabinet and the desk. What he had discovered was not immediately obvious, but rather emerged through the careful observation of what was absent rather than what was present. The ledgers and papers that Mrs. Ashford had examined on the afternoon of her death had been systematically returned to their proper places. Yet there remained a curious gap in the filing sequence, a space where certain documents ought to have been but were not. The missing documents, judging from the labels and the organizational system Mrs. Ashford had maintained, would have related to the years 1902 and 1903, the precise period during which Edward Harrington's financial crisis had occurred. It was at this moment, standing in the study with the afternoon light streaming through the window and illuminating the precise location of the missing documents, that Whimsy had experienced that particular sensation of intellectual clarity that accompanied the resolution of a previously obscure problem. The murderer had not been motivated by a desire to silence Mrs. Ashford's intentions to vindicate Edward Harrington. On the contrary, the murderer had been motivated by the desperate necessity of preventing Mrs. Ashford from discovering or revealing the identity of the true perpetrator of the embezzlement, someone whose continued security and social position depended absolutely upon the concealment of facts that Mrs. Ashford had, quite suddenly, resolved to unearth. The question that now presented itself with crystalline force was this: who at Thornfield Manor, or within the extended Ashford family, had possessed both the knowledge of what those documents contained and the motive to ensure their suppression? The answer, Whimsy reflected as he stood in the study examining the empty filing space, was almost certainly someone whose relationship to the events of 1903 was far more intimate than anyone had yet considered. Someone, perhaps, who had been a child in 1903, too young to fully comprehend the circumstances that had resulted in their family's financial salvation, but old enough, in the subsequent decades, to understand that their comfortable existence had been built upon a foundation of concealed dishonesty. Someone, in short, who had not yet been adequately questioned regarding their knowledge of Mrs. Ashford's activities on the afternoon of her death, and whose movements during the critical hours between 4 o'clock and 9:30 had never been subjected to the sort of rigorous scrutiny that would have exposed a deliberate deception. The realization that Whimsy's suspicions had crystallized into a coherent theory regarding the identity of Mrs. Ashford's murderer necessitated a period of careful observation and deliberate restraint, for nothing would have been more counterproductive than to reveal his convictions prematurely to Inspector Bracegirdle, who would undoubtedly have seized upon the theory with the enthusiasm of a drowning man grasping at a plank, regardless of whether that plank possessed sufficient buoyancy to support the weight of actual evidence. Instead, Wimsey had returned to the Crown and Lion, had ensconced himself in the private parlour with a bottle of decent Burgundy and a pad of notepaper, and had begun the methodical process of reconstructing the events of the evening in question with a sort of meticulous attention to chronological detail that would have impressed a railway timetable inspector. The critical window of time through which the murder must have been committed extended from approximately 4:30, when Catherine Ashford had departed Thornfield Manor, and Mrs. Ashford had retreated to the study to examine her papers until approximately 7 o'clock, when Mrs. Ashford had changed into the Evening Cardigan and settled herself in the library with her needlework. During this interval of 2.5 hours, someone had entered the study, had become aware of Mrs. Ashford's intentions to examine and potentially reveal the contents of certain documents, and had taken the decision, instantaneous or premeditated, Wimsey was not yet certain which, to silence her permanently. The murderer had then either left the house immediately, relying upon the cover of dusk and the relative inattention of the household staff, or had remained within the house, waiting for an opportune moment to depart without drawing attention to their movements. What was most significant about this reconstructed timeline was that it excluded, quite definitively, anyone who could not have been present at Thornfield Manor at the critical moment. James Ashford had been at the Crown and Lion, his presence verified by 7 independent witnesses of unimpeachable credibility. Catherine Ashford had been, according to her own account and Mrs. Wickham's partial corroboration, at the Grange. The servants, insofar as their movements could be verified, had been engaged in their ordinary duties about the house. Yet someone had been present, someone with sufficient knowledge of the household routines to know that Mrs. Ashford would be alone in the study during that particular interval, someone with sufficient understanding of the house's geography to navigate to and from the study without encountering other members of the household, and someone with sufficient emotional motivation to commit an act of violence in defense of a secret that threatened their security. Wimsey's investigation had therefore necessarily shifted its focus to those individuals whose presence at Thornfield Manor was a given, whose movements during the critical hours might reasonably be open to question, and whose relationship to the events of 1903 provided them with both motive and knowledge. Miss Phyllis Ashford remained, despite her convincing display of shock and grief, a woman whose domestic position and financial security depended absolutely upon the preservation of the Ashford family's reputation and respectability. She had been at Thornfield Manor at the time of the murder, and, although she had been observed by servants at various points during the afternoon and early evening, the servants' accounts of her movements had been sufficiently vague to permit considerable flexibility in their interpretation. She had claimed to be in her room, resting, during the critical hours between 4:30 and 7 o'clock, a claim that could not be definitively verified without the testimony of a witness, and no such witness had come forward. More significantly, Wimsey had learned through his examination of the household records that Miss Phyllis Ashford had been born in 1882, which would have rendered her approximately 21 years of age at the time of the events of 1903. She would have been old enough to observe her family's financial crisis and its resolution, old enough to understand that something important had occurred, yet young enough that the full implications might have escaped her at the time. If she had, in the subsequent years, become aware of the true circumstances underlying the Ashford family's financial salvation, she would have possessed both the knowledge and the motivation to prevent their revelation. Yet there was another possibility that Wimsey had begun to consider with increasing seriousness, a possibility that was suggested by certain remarks that Miss Ashford had made during their conversation, remarks that had seemed innocuous at the time, but now, when examined in the context of what Wimsey had discovered regarding the missing documents, possessed a rather more sinister significance. Miss Ashford had mentioned almost in passing that her mother had been a woman of considerable strength of character, a woman who had always placed family duty above personal inclination. Such a remark, innocuously phrased, nevertheless suggested a daughter who had inherited her mother's capacity for the ruthless subordination of sentiment to practical necessity. If Mrs. Ashford had, in the hours following Catherine's departure, reached a decision to reveal the truth regarding the events of 1903, a decision that would have necessarily involved exposing the dishonesty that had been perpetrated by a member of the Ashford family, then her daughter would have possessed a compelling motive to prevent that revelation. The missing documents, Wimsey reflected as he poured himself a second glass of Burgundy, represented the crucial piece of evidence that would ultimately prove decisive. Someone had removed those documents from the study on the evening of the murder, had presumably concealed them somewhere within or without Thornfield Manor, and had apparently succeeded in preventing their discovery by the police. Yet documents of such crucial importance would not have been destroyed. They would have been carefully preserved, hidden away against some future necessity or contingency. If Wimsey could locate those documents, or more importantly, if he could determine precisely what they contained and what they revealed regarding the true perpetrator of the embezzlement, he would possess the final thread necessary to unravel the entire carefully constructed web of deception that had resulted in murder, the search for the missing documents, which Wimsey undertook with the sort of meticulous discretion that would have been entirely invisible. To anyone not specifically observing for signs of systematic investigation, proved to be considerably more straightforward than he had initially anticipated. The difficulty, as he had learned through decades of investigative experience, was rarely in discovering where an individual had concealed something of value, but rather in understanding the particular psychology that dictated the choice of hiding place. People, Wimsey had observed, rarely concealed important documents in locations that were truly remote or inaccessible. On the contrary, they invariably selected hiding places that were, in some psychological sense, comforting, locations that possessed some form of emotional or practical significance to the concealer, locations that could be accessed with relative ease when necessary, and locations that would appear innocuous to any observer who happened to discover them by accident. With this principle in mind, Wimsey had devoted considerable attention to examining Miss Phyllis Ashford's private chambers, not with any intention of conducting an improper invasion of her privacy, but rather with the careful respect for propriety that one would extend to a woman of her station. He had, in the course of this examination, undertaken a detailed inspection of her writing desk, her wardrobe, and the various drawers and compartments that constituted the ordinary apparatus of a woman's private space. What he had discovered, tucked beneath a false bottom in what appeared to be an ordinary jewelry box, was a bundle of documents bound with string and wrapped in oilcloth, documents that, upon cursory examination, appeared to relate precisely to the financial transactions of 1902 and 1903. The documents themselves told a story of considerable complexity and considerable dishonesty. The embezzlement that had been perpetrated upon Edward Harrington's employer, a firm of Consey, durable antiquity known as Westbrook and Associates, had not been the work of a single individual acting upon personal inclination toward larceny. Rather, it had been a carefully orchestrated scheme involving the systematic misappropriation of client funds over a period of several months, a scheme that had required not only opportunity but also access to the firm's most confidential financial records. Edward Harrington, as a junior partner in the firm, had possessed the requisite access and the circumstantial evidence against him. The forged documents, the falsified account books, the withdrawal of substantial sums from accounts over which he exercised nominal authority had been sufficiently convincing to result in his prosecution and conviction on charges of embezzlement. What the documents in Miss Ashford's jewelry box revealed, however, was that Edward Harrington had been deliberately constructed as a scapegoat for a crime that had been perpetrated by someone else entirely, someone with considerably greater access to the firm's financial apparatus and considerably greater authority to effect the necessary withdrawals and falsifications. The architect of the embezzlement, according to the carefully preserved evidence that Mrs. Ashford had apparently compiled during some earlier period of investigation, had been none other than Mr. Cecil Ashford himself, Margaret Cornwell's intended second husband, who had been employed at that time as the senior accountant for the firm of Westbrook and Associates. The documents made abundantly clear that Cecil Ashford, faced with severe personal financial difficulties resulting from losses incurred through speculative investments and borrowing against property that he did not entirely own, had systematically appropriated client funds with the intention of concealing his own peculations by arranging circumstantial evidence against Edward Harrington, whose youth and lack of extensive connections within the firm rendered him a plausible target for such an accusation. The tragedy that had resulted from this calculated deception was the destruction of Edward Harrington's life and reputation, the termination of his engagement to Margaret Cornwell, and the subsequent financial ruin of his family, all of which had been deliberately engineered by Cecil Ashford in order to conceal his own criminal activity and secure his own financial recovery through marriage to a woman of considerable inherited wealth. The documents further suggested that Margaret Cornwell, in the years following her marriage to Cecil Ashford, had gradually come to suspect the truth regarding the embezzlement, and that she had, at some point in her marriage, conducted a thorough investigation that had resulted in the compilation of the very evidence that now rested in her daughter's jewelry box. The critical question that this discovery raised was not whether Miss Phyllis Ashford had possessed knowledge of these documents' existence, but rather what she had done with them upon discovering that her mother intended to reveal their contents. The documents represented not merely a vindication of Edward Harrington's memory, but a complete and devastating exposure of Cecil Ashford's criminal dishonesty, a revelation that would have resulted in criminal prosecution, social disgrace, and the probable dissolution of Phyllis's comfortable position within respectable society. For a woman of Miss Ashford's generation and sensibilities, the prospect of her father's public exposure as a criminal and her mother's capacity for such ruthless exposure of family secrets would have seemed not merely distasteful but absolutely intolerable. What Wimsey had therefore uncovered was not merely the motive for murder, but the precise nature of the psychological conflict that must have tormented Miss Phyllis Ashford during the hours preceding her mother's death. She had come to understand, through some means that he had yet to fully determine, that her mother had recovered the documents and intended to employ them as the basis for revelations that would destroy the Ashford family's reputation and standing. Faced with this knowledge, Miss Ashford had experienced the full force of a conflict between her duty to her mother and her duty to her father's memory, and, more pressingly, between her mother's intentions and her own vital interest in the preservation of her comfortable life and social position. In the end, the conflict had resolved itself not through conscious deliberation, but through the immediacy of violent action, an action that had seemed, in the moment of its commission, to be the only possible response to an intolerable situation. The final confrontation between Lord Peter Wimsey and Miss Phyllis Ashford took place not in the drawing-room at Thornfield Manor, where Inspector Bracegirdle would have conducted such proceedings with all the theatrical clumsiness of a man accustomed to extracting confessions through the application of accusatory bluntness, but rather in the small study, where the documents remained concealed in the jewelry box, a location that Wimsey had deliberately selected for its psychological significance and its isolation from the ordinary movements of the household. He had arranged the meeting under the pretext of clarifying certain minor inconsistencies in her account of her mother's final evening, a pretext so transparent that Miss Ashford would have understood, upon receiving his note, that he had discovered something of consequence. She had presented herself at the study with the sort of rigid composure that suggested she had braced herself for precisely this contingency, and she had remained, standing rather than accepting the offered chair, a posture that suggested she intended this interview to be brief and conducted on terms of her own choosing. Wimsey had begun, characteristically, not with accusation but with observation, remarking upon the peculiar quality of the Evening Cardigan and the psychological significance of its removal from Mrs. Ashford's person at a time when one would ordinarily have expected her to draw it more closely around herself against the autumn chill. He had observed that the removal of the cardigan suggested not physical discomfort, but emotional rupture, a symbolic disengagement from the sentimental associations that the garment represented. He had then proceeded to discuss, in the manner of one making idle conversation, the curious fact that Mrs. Ashford had apparently conducted an investigation into events of 1903, an investigation that must have required considerable time and effort, and which would hardly have been undertaken unless she had possessed some compelling reason to revisit the circumstances of her broken engagement and her subsequent marriage to Mr. Cecil Ashford. Finally, with the sort of gentle inevitability that characterized his most devastating revelations, he had produced the documents from the jewelry box and had laid them upon the study desk, observing that they seemed to tell a rather interesting story regarding the true perpetrator of the embezzlement that had destroyed Edward Harrington's life. Miss Ashford had remained silent for a considerable period following this revelation, her face slowly draining of color as she comprehended the full implications of what Whimsy had discovered. When she had finally spoken, her voice had possessed the hollow quality of someone whose carefully constructed defenses had crumbled beyond reconstruction. She had not attempted to deny the facts that Whimsy had assembled, nor had she attempted to construct alternative explanations for the evidence he had laid before her. Instead, she had asked, with a sort of desperate quietness, whether he intended to deliver her to the police and whether her father's reputation would be restored as a consequence of her mother's death and her own subsequent exposure. The answer to this question, Whimsy had explained with considerable delicacy, depended entirely upon the truthfulness and completeness of the account that Miss Ashford was now prepared to provide regarding the events of the evening in question. He had not, he had assured her, made any commitment to Inspector Bracegirdle regarding the identity of the murderer, nor had he provided the constabulary with the documentation that would establish Cecil Ashford's guilt in the original embezzlement. The decision regarding how these matters would ultimately be resolved rested, in considerable measure, upon whether Miss Ashford was prepared to acknowledge the truth of what had occurred and to accept the consequences that such acknowledgement would necessarily entail. What Miss Ashford had then revealed, in a voice that grew progressively steadier as she proceeded, was the account of her discovery, early on the afternoon of the murder, that her mother had been engaged in the systematic investigation of matters relating to her marriage. She had found her mother in the study, surrounded by documents and ledgers, tears streaming down her face as she examined evidence that could no longer be denied or explained away. Her mother had explained to her with brutal honesty that her marriage to Cecil Ashford had been built upon a foundation of deception, that the man she had married had deliberately destroyed an innocent person's life in order to conceal his own crimes, and that she had finally resolved to expose this truth regardless of the personal consequences. Miss Ashford had attempted to dissuade her, had pleaded with her to consider the impact that such revelations would have upon the family's reputation and upon her own future prospects. Her mother had remained unmoved, had insisted that some truths were too important to remain concealed, and had announced her intention to consult with the police regarding the original embezzlement and to ensure that Edward Harrington's name would be cleared and his reputation restored. In a moment of desperation and panic, Miss Ashford had seized a marble bookend from the study desk and had, without premeditation or conscious deliberation, struck her mother a violent blow to the head. She had acted. She had insisted to Whimsy, not from malice or cruelty, but from a sort of blind panic, a fear so consuming that it had overwhelmed all other considerations and had resulted in an act whose horror she had barely comprehended until it was too late for correction or redemption. She had removed the documents and had concealed them in her jewelry box, had arranged her mother's person and clothing in the library, as if to suggest a sudden cardiac event, and had then raised an alarm, knowing that her action would immediately render her the center of attention and suspicion, and yet knowing also that the police would eventually be satisfied that the crime had been committed by someone else. Whimsy had listened to this confession with the sort of compassionate attention that he extended only to those whose crimes had been motivated by understandable human frailty rather than by deliberate malice or calculated self-interest. When she had finished speaking, he had remained silent for a considerable period, regarding her with an expression of profound sadness. He had then explained with the sort of quiet finality that had always characterized his most terrible judgments, that some actions not be undone, that some consequences must be accepted regardless of one's sincere desire to escape them, and that the only possible path to any form of redemption or restoration lay through the acceptance of full responsibility for what had been done and the truth regarding why it had been done.